Hello, I'm Dr. Ed Safer, professor at Florida Community College in Jacksonville. In our first discussion of the Cradle of Civilization, we looked at the history of the human origin for some 900,000 years, ending with the founding of the first city of Jericho. I'm now in the great eastern Arabian desert, just a few short steps from the last remnant of the wonders of the ancient world, the pyramids of Giza, that is protected by its ominous Sphinx. Here we are going to start our second discussion of the Cradle of Civilization, in which we are going to look at a group of people that actually provided us one of the greatest cultures known to man. During a short span of only 2,000 years, they provided us with the history of astronomy, mathematics, geometry. They developed our calendar. They showed us how to irrigate land and how to build some magnificent temples and tombs. If you will follow with me, we will walk through these steps, starting at 3000 BC, and trace the history of the pharaohs, their monuments, and their temples in our story of the Cradle of Civilization.
Our story begins in 3100 BCE, approximately 5,000 years ago, when the legendary king Nama of Upper Egypt completes the unification by conquering the Delta people of Lower Egypt. A slate palette, now on exhibit in the Egyptian Museum, was found in Hierakonpolis, a political and religious center of Upper Egypt. We can see Nama, mace in hand, and wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt, about to strike the head of the Lower Egyptian enemy. Also seen on this palette is the falcon representing the Horus god, holding in his talons the papyrus, a symbol of Lower Egypt. The other plant sacred to the region of Upper Egypt was the lotus flower. It was not until 2640 BCE that the capital of Egypt was moved from Thinis, or Abydos, to Memphis during the rule of Zoser. Here is a statue of Zoser. Little remains of this ancient capital, but here we see the embalming house for the sacred Apis bull. The sacred bull was accorded divine status as the son of Ptah, the national god of the Memphis triad. Earlier kings of Egypt chose as their final resting place chambers made of mud brick, called mastaba. This is an example of a mastaba. It is designed with multiple rooms to hold the personal effects of the dead, including food, clothing, and household goods. It was not until the Third Dynasty, during the rule of Zoser, that the king ordered his architect to build a unique burial tomb unlike any other mastaba. Imhotep thus designed and built the step pyramid of Saqqara, a short distance from Memphis. As we view the pyramid, we can see that it was merely mastabas built one on top of the other. The pyramid was built from local sandstone of somewhat poor quality. Here we see two temples called the House of the North and the House of the South, symbolizing Zoser as the ruler of Upper and Lower Egypt. Directly behind the step pyramid, we see the remains of the Pyramid of Unas. This was the last king of the Fifth Dynasty. The pyramid was poorly constructed and is in disrepair. However, inside the pyramid is the earliest reliefs and burial inscriptions that have been found anywhere in Egypt. Probably the greatest period of pyramid building occurred during the Fourth Dynasty in 2575 to 2465 BCE. Senefru built his pyramid at Meidum, but the three pyramids of Giza still remain as the first of the seven wonders of the world. The Pyramid of Cheops is the largest. It is said that it took 100,000 men working 3 months a year, nearly 20 years to erect. The original vertical axis was 481 feet. The base measurement was originally 756 feet on each of its 4 sides. This was the burial mound for one person. His wives and children were buried in the surrounding mastabas. The second pyramid was built for the king Chephren, the successor to Cheops. Originally, the pyramid stood 10 feet shorter than Cheops, but due to the ravages of time and the desert sands, it appears higher. Some of the original plaster remains at the apex. The third and the smallest pyramid was built by the king Mycerinus. There is no record to indicate why this pyramid did not attain the size of the others. Some theorize that the king died before its completion, or the royal treasury was depleted after completion of the other 2. Famous as the pyramids, is the guardian of the necropolis, the Sphinx. The Sphinx was hewn from natural rock at the site. It is the recumbent body of the lion and the head, supposedly, of the king Chephren. It wears the royal head cloth and the cobra. Many myths and legends abound about the Sphinx. One such story tells of a young prince of ancient Egypt who hears the Sphinx speak. He tells the prince to remove the sand that covers its body, and if he does this deed, he will surely become king of Egypt. The prince completed the task, and although he was not the eldest son, he did become Amenophis IV, ruling in 1402 BCE, nearly 1100 years after the Sphinx was built. Probably the greatest monument built by man in honor of his god was the Temple of Karnak, located in the precincts of the capital and religious center of Egypt, Thebes. The temple and its buildings cover some 200 acres. Nearly every king who ruled Egypt from as early as the 11th dynasty in 2000 BCE to the Ptolemies in 51 BCE contributed to the expansion of this temple. The temple is dedicated to the Theban god Amun-Re, his wife Mut, and his son Khonsu. Although Amun-Re was originally considered a local god, he attained national prominence as Theban priests spread their influence throughout the entire country. As a result, other local gods became secondary in importance to the Theban triad. What we are about to see are some of the highlights of this edifice. Within the confines of the walls, you could place St. Peter's Cathedral of Rome, the Cathedral of Milan, and Notre Dame's Cathedral of Paris. As we are about to enter the first pylon, we see 2 rows of Sphinx with ram's heads. The ram was one of the symbols representing Amun. The avenue of the Sphinx was attributed to Ramses II, and they line the road from the quarry to the temple. The first pylon we enter was erected by the Ethiopian kings of the 25th dynasty, ruling Egypt from 712 to 664 BCE. Although not completed, the wall was 370 feet wide and 142 feet high. Now on the inside, we see the continuation of the Sphinx, as well as the remains of the mud brick ramp necessary for the construction of the pylon. In the forecourt, we see a small temple dedicated to the Theban triad, built by Seti. In the center, Mut to the left and Khonsu to the right. The next temple in the forecourt, and dedicated to Amun, was built by Ramses III of the 20th dynasty. As we are about to enter the temple area, we see 2 statues of Ramses III wearing the crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, guarding the entrance way. In the peristyle court, we see the king standing as the god of the afterlife, Osiris. Finally, we enter the hypostyle hall with its capital columns, where the king makes offerings to Amun and the other gods of Egypt. Before entering through the second pylon, we see a statue of Ramses II, and standing by his feet is a statue of Nefertari, his favorite wife. The second pylon was built by Ramses II and is the entrance into the greatest hypostyle hall ever built. The area covers some 54,000 square feet, containing 134 columns. On each column, the open floor capital has enough room for 100 people to stand. The hypostyle hall, in honor of Amun, was constructed by Ramses II and his father, Seti I. Another point of interest are the two obelisks dedicated by Hatshepsut, the first female to declare herself pharaoh of Egypt. One is dedicated in her name, and the other in the name of Thutmose I, her father. War reliefs adorn the northern wall of the temple. Here we see Seti I describing his victories over Libya and Palestine. In this scene we see Seti clubbing his victims in front of Amun-Re. This scene depicts Seti in his chariot shooting arrows at the Hittite enemy. One of the greatest kings of Egypt was Thutmose III, who extended his rule into Syria. Many of the buildings of Karnak are attributed to this king. Here we see the seventh pylon, as well as statues depicting Thutmose as Osiris. Beyond this point we can see the eighth pylon, attributed to Hatshepsut. This is considered the oldest pylon within the temple confines. Turning south from Karnak, and only a few miles away, is the Temple of Luxor. The temple was built by Amenopis III on the site of an earlier temple known as the Southern Harem of Amun. Although smaller than its neighboring temple, Karnak, it was built in a similar fashion, with succeeding kings contributing to the expansion. We look at the first pylon erected by Ramses II. Originally, there were 6 statues at the entrance to the temple, 2 sitting and 4 standing. The obelisk, also dedicated to Ramses II, stands on the original site, and the inscriptions describe the king as the founder of this splendid building dedicated to Amun. On the outer walls of the pylons, although difficult to distinguish, Ramses traces his most famous war campaign against the Hittites at Kadesh, which occurred during the 5th year of his reign. The most famous scene shows Ramses in his chariot, charging the enemy and launching arrows against them. At the conclusion of the battle, there was no apparent winner, but by the time Ramses returned to Egypt, he was proclaimed a hero throughout the land. Ramses had the same inscription placed in the Temple at Abu Simbel, which we will view next, as well as his funerary temple and at Abydos. Passing through the pylons, we enter into the Great Court, also built by Ramses. As we look around the court, we can see multiple statues of the king, averaging 23 feet in height. Originally, there were 74 papyrus columns with capitals. At this point, we see 2 more statues of Ramses. The young man standing next to the crown is over 6 feet tall. Here is a figure of Ramses and his queen seated as we enter into the court of Amenopis III. As mentioned earlier, each king who ruled Egypt, whether native or foreign-born, paid homage to Amun-Re at Karnak and Thebes. It is here that we find the inscription by Alexander the Great, who conquered Egypt in 332 BCE, and he too accepted the deity of Amun. We last visit the colossal temples in the south of Egypt at Abu Simbel. These 2 temples were scheduled to be lost with the construction of the high dam at Aswan and the formation of Lake Nasser. UNESCO asked and received permission to move the temples to higher ground, approximately 200 feet above current water level. As a result of world support, these temples, built 3,200 years ago, have been saved for future generations to see. The temples at Abu Simbel were erected by Ramses II, the larger dedicated to the gods Amun-Re of Thebes and Re-Herakti of Heliopolis, the principal deities of Upper and Lower Egypt. The smaller temple was dedicated to goddess Hathor and Ramses' favorite wife, Nefertari. As we approach the temple, we see 6 statues, each standing 33 feet high. On both sides of the entrance, there are 2 statues of Ramses and one of his wife. Approaching the larger temple for Reharakti, we see 4 colossal statues of Ramses, each seated on a throne. Each colossus is over 65 feet high. The small statue directly over the entrance is that of Reharakti. The smaller statues at the feet of Ramses are members of his family, 2 daughters, a son, his wife, and his mother, Tua. These statues appear small, but they are larger than life-size. We enter the hypostyle hall and we see 8 figures of Ramses standing 30 feet high and posing as the god Osiris. Along the walls we see beautiful reliefs in their original colors, depicting Ramses adoring the various deities of Egypt. Ramses recorded on the walls of the temple his major battle against the Hittites at Kadesh, and again here is the scene of Ramses in his chariot shooting arrows at the enemy. To the rear of the temple is the sanctuary containing the Holy of Holies. In this recess we see 4 seated gods, the Memphis god Ptah, Amun-Re, the national god, Ramses, and Reharakti, god of Heliopolis. Twice a year on February 20th and October 20th, the latter date corresponding with Ramses' coronation, the sun aligns with the temple axis, illuminating the faces of the 3 sun gods. The Memphis god Ptah, whose cult had no solar connection, is always left in the dark.
With the death of Ramses II in 1220 BCE, we see a slow decline in the influence of Egypt as a major power. They became more prone to foreign invaders, which included the Ethiopians, the Libyans, the Persians, the Greeks, and finally the Romans. Most of their architecture and their building of temples subsided, mainly due to the lack of funds. It was not until the 3rd century BCE did the Greeks start to rebuild some of the temples. In the following scenes, we will see some of the temples built by the Ptolemies at Phila, at Komomo, at Edfu, and Esna. These temples were all Greek design, but also dedicated to the gods of Egypt. In closing, I would like to comment that we should look to the Egyptians as a major contributor to our culture and our humanity. Still standing as a guardian over this ancient land are its pyramids and the silent Sphinx.